Moving ahead to our next session, we have a panel discussion coming up on the topic Mainstreaming Voices from the Global South, the Role of Media, Corporate and Philanthropies. Our panelists today include Arun Sudhaman, CEO of Provoke Media, Radharani Mitra, Global Creative Advisor at BBC Media Action, and we were also to have Vaishali Mishra join us. However, she's unable to join in today due to unavoidable circumstances. Moderating this panel today is Girish Balachandran, founder of On Purpose Consulting. This session is curated by On Purpose, and we will start by a short presentation by Girish, after which the panelists will join him on stage. Girish?
Good afternoon. Thank you, Amit and Spectra, for this opportunity. As Indian businesses go global and communication functions in India go global, I think we really need to evaluate how we present ourselves to the rest of the world in terms of how narratives are created and what is the role of communicators in helping shape those narratives from the global south to lead to more balanced world narratives. But first, there's a lot of debate about what the global south really is. Does anybody have a view on which option it is? Anyone? It's wannabe, not pretending it's the South. Okay, thank you, Madhavan. Anyone else? What is the global South? Does it even make sense today? We started with BRIC, we went on to BRICS, and today we have global South. So the global south is a geopolitical concept used to refer to countries and regions that are generally less economically developed compared to countries in the northern hemisphere. It encompasses nations located in Latin America, Africa, Asia, although the term is more fluid and may include other criteria beyond just geography. It's important to note that the Global South is not solely defined by economic indicators. It also encompasses political, cultural, and historical factors, as well as issues related to colonialism, imperialism, and global power dynamics. So the world is at an inflection point. A new world order is emerging from countries in the Global South that are driving health and development priorities, pioneering exciting medical, scientific financing and policy breakthroughs that open the door to healthier and more fulfilling lives for billions of people. Media and global policymakers often fail to recognize this global change, which slows progress. The current global health and development narrative is reflexively depicted as a Western story, skewing our collective understanding of where and how development breakthroughs occur and preventing those breakthroughs from helping those who need them. It's our responsibility and privilege as communicators to sensitize stakeholders and update world narratives with more voices from the Global South. First, let me illustrate the problem. Voices from the Global South are often left out and ignored in climate conversations. Every activist has a story to tell. Every story has a solution to give. Every solution has a life to change. Global South countries need common voice and platforms to make substantial contributions to the promotion of multilateralism. The Vietnamese president, Nguyen Xuan Phuc, said at the Voice of the Global South summit hosted by India last year in Jan. Standing beside the US President Biden at the June 22 White House press conference, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi declared that lending a voice to the priorities of the Global South was a central objective of India's G20 chairmanship, and substantial progress was achieved in this regard. We'll talk a little bit more about this in a bit. When it comes to choices between investments in climate action and alleviating poverty, well-off nations seem to have forgotten that while they're no longer plagued by poverty-related ills, such as hunger and illiteracy, most people in the world still are. The globalization of Western media has been a major influence in shaping the global media landscape. Nevertheless, the traditional dominance of Western media is also being challenged by the advent of and availability of non-Western media, resulting in a flow of media products that is not merely vertically from the West to the rest. An interesting example is Al Jazeera, which positions itself as an influential non-Western news organization on the international stage. It transformed the political and strategic environment by offering graphic footage and opinions to break stereotypes, change the narrative, and connect people across cultures. So what can the world learn from innovation in the Global South? Let's look at two examples. Bangladesh has become a global leader on climate adaptation, not out of ambition, but out of necessity as one of the planet's most affected countries by climate change. 2/3 of Bangladesh is less than 5 meters above sea level, and already up to 2,000 climate migrants arrive every day in Dhaka. The country has had no choice but to rapidly develop solutions for climate adaptation in response to chronic and worsening floods in northeastern Bangladesh, making it impossible for children to get to school. They're increasingly using boat schools, which bring classrooms on the water directly to students. Practical adaptations like these could spread to other countries facing similar challenges. I have a question for you. What's the first thing that comes to mind when you hear South Korea? South Korea, first thing that comes to mind. Anyone? K-pop? Go ahead. Sorry, say that again? Skincare, okay, thank you. Cuisine. Lovely to see you, Nikhil. Okay. At the 92nd Academy Awards, the South Korean film Parasite won all 4 awards out of 6 nominations, becoming the first non-English language film to win Best Picture. In 2022, Squid Game star Lee Jung-jae became the first Asian to win the Best Actor Emmy. The 49-year-old South Korean actor beat 4 others, including veteran actor Brian Cox of Succession fame. Who would have imagined that South Korea could reach and addict a global audience? A country that relied on US aid until the 1960s is now investing tens of billions of dollars to build new electric vehicles, next generation batteries, and semiconductors in the United States. That apart, household names from like Samsung, LG, and Hyundai have supercharged the South Korean economy for the past 4 decades. Today, it's difficult to believe that not even a century ago, India was colonized. In fact, the youngest members of the workforce, the Gen Z and the millennials, are only the 3rd generation of an independent India. And we're massively proud of the progress we've made in these years. And there are many of us, 1.4 billion in India alone. It's no rocket science to understand why the Global South's development strategy is a people-centric one. Our communication is the voice of change for billions who live in the Global South world, who are most vulnerable to climate change, rising prices, and supply chain disruptions, and for the undeniable one future that this interconnected world shares. The G20 summit held last year culminated with the adoption of the Delhi Declaration. A deeper analysis reveals that India and other Global South countries that joined to formulate the document included Indonesia, Brazil, and South Africa, which together weave the issues that pertain to the anxieties of the developing world and enhance their representation in the grouping. Global South terminologies in development and diplomacy matter. Nuanced context and the position of the Global South in the world matters. Understanding the implication of war and climate change on the Global South matters. highlighting development incentives, and outlining the public costs of failure is key to the Global South's arrival on the world stage. Another example, very quickly, look at the climate change argument from the lens of the Global South. The Global North or developed countries have long blamed the Global South or developing countries for being the major polluters, pointing out the fact that the Global South is home to a large and growing population. When you look at CO2 emissions per capita, a very different picture emerges. In 2020, the average CO2 emissions per capita in the Global North were 10.6 tons, while in the Global South they were 3.4. This means that people in the Global North emit 3 times more CO2 per capita than people in the Global South. Therefore, the concept of a just transition, a transition that considers the needs of countries in the Global South to pull massive amounts of people out of poverty, the need for reskilling the millions of people involved in coal production to green jobs as we accelerate towards more sustainable energy futures. So what does this all mean? Shameless plug. On Purpose works at the intersection of communications and social change in climate action, public health, education, and gender. Through our work bringing brands and communities together, we've learned that the first step towards change is the acknowledgement and recognition of our own situation of power and privilege. Only through this process can we analyze with lucidity the situation we are embedded in and eventually propose strategies that can challenge the status quo. We've also learned that most of the time there is no magnificent strategy in front of us, but a series of small steps that could together build change. To conclude, from digital public infrastructure to tackling climate change, the Global South can offer solutions that put people at the center of change. How the progressive nations of the South organize themselves over the next decade will have a profound impact on humanity's progress. It also requires global institutions, both new and old, to respond to the demands of the Global South. A new order is being scripted, and the Global South has an extraordinary pen to write this chapter of humanity. May I now invite Arun and Radharani to join me on stage as we decode this further.
I can't quite decide whether it's age or gender.
Welcome, Radharani and Arun. I must admit, I'm sort of approaching this conversation with slight nervousness because I know that we have very interesting views to share. Hopefully, we can all learn from what's going to be discussed. So, starting with you, Radharani, so much of your work has been in gender, adolescence, women's economic power, bridging the digital divide across continents of Asia and Africa. So tell us about, the most important principles, in your opinion, that can be used to represent voices in the Global South.
Thanks, Girish, and thanks, Spectra, for having me here. It's a very, very interesting assembly of people, and I'm really delighted to be able to share my views on a few things. But may I start by being contrarian, please?
We would expect nothing less.
Right. So I've always had a problem with the terms Global North and Global South because it seems to me that it's kind of mandated by one for the other. Now, since these terms were coined, and we were just talking about this, that most often some of these terms are imperfect, but even taking that into account, since these terms were coined, the world has changed immeasurably. The geopolitical landscape looks completely different. Populations are burgeoning, so marketplaces are burgeoning too. And the demographies within these populations are changing. The scene of action, if you take anything, be it manufacturing, be it artificial intelligence, be it digital infrastructure, creative industries, everything, there is no one place where it's happening. It's kind of, proliferating all over the world. And so in this rapidly changing universe that we live in, I think the terms constrict us. So would you allow me to, if I need to, use the term global majority, because in my head, that's what it is about, right? Having said that, there are two things before I dive into the answer. I think that there are, many similarities and, of course, discrepancies or dissimilarities that are there between, one section of the world to another. So what are the preoccupations? What are the things that world over people are thinking about? There is, of course, rising fundamentalism, shrinking space for democracy. There is climate change that kind of traverses from climate anxiety to climate action, disproportionate responsibilities and accountabilities being imposed, and there's a huge sort of, conflict, strife about that. Then there is, the world of digital, artificial intelligence. Everybody's scared, everybody's excited, and of course, there is gender, because in spite of all the advances humanity has made in gender, and gender is not just about women, there are such vast inequalities, whether it comes from norms, whether it comes from the pay gap, opportunities, design, the digital gender gap. So these are the preoccupations that the world is facing. But if you look at different, on a regional and on a national basis, there are many other preoccupations that perhaps, the more developed, more mature economies and societies don't face. They have other preoccupations. So for example, I've worked extensively on different health subjects, from tuberculosis to HIV to family health, then sanitation, and of course all the things that you mentioned, growing up in India, adolescence. And I've had it seems kind of strange when I say this, but I've been extraordinarily fortunate in working on two of the biggest health crises that have occurred in the world in the last sort of 10 years. One was the Ebola epidemic. It wasn't called a pandemic, in West Africa in 2014, 15, and then of course the pandemic. And some of the strategies that we have used is really, the principles of communication remain the same. And for those of you, for many of you, although I've worked at Media Action for a long, long time, using media and communications for social impact, across formats, channels, issues, platforms, but I grew up in advertising. I spent nearly 2 decades in advertising. So the communication principles are very much the same, right? So we are always looking at human-centered design, evidence-based, powered by insights, and then really think about paradigm shifting, paradigm changing, out-of-the-box ideas, and design interventions in a way that would have impact. And then, of course, you start thinking, oh, would that win an award, for those of us who have had a private sector background? So some of the things that are that one has practiced is at the to begin with and to end with, audiences have to be at the heart of everything you do, right? So, and change is a continuum, and change has the way I look at it is change has 4 levels. So when you're designing, say, an intervention on growing up in India and gender, that is about gender stereotyping, gender-based violence, nutrition, adolescent health, menstruation, all of this, norms, gender norms, you are looking at people you're communicating to, so communities, individuals, householders, young and old. Then you're looking at practitioners, so people like frontline workers, be it from health or sanitation, teachers, religious leaders, and various other people who practice something, because you have to work to them. Sometimes they are your audiences, and sometimes you have to work with them. Then you're working with organizations. So I could be working with many people in this room, to take my stories across to people who are not within our sector. Equally, I could be working with telecom, I could be working with, people who have, who kind of, digital companies and production companies, everything. And then finally the system. Because when you're designing an intervention, you want scale. Now, so you look at evidence, you look at learning from the field. That is non-negotiable. So we go through a process of immersion, because as Arun was saying, that culture is really from there, and your work also has to be culture-based. That's one. The second thing is that I think that it's very important to form partnerships, because at the end of the day, unlike big brands, big or small or mid-sized brands, when you're working on donor-funded interventions for social impact, you don't have a separate pot of money to do PR, right? Or to kind of, your visibility and influencing strategy, therefore, has to be unique, it has to be bespoke, and it has to be different. So for example, you could say that, but if you're doing such great work, it should automatically attract audiences, but we know it doesn't work like that. So one of the visibility and influencing strategies that we have used is very, very inherent in the work and the impact we do. So we've often worked with academics and research organizations who are looking at the impact, and then we are writing things up and publishing papers in the most prestigious journals of the world. We've had a slew of papers in British Medical Journal on the work that we did on mobile services, which are the largest in the world today, Kilkari, which means a baby's gurgle, and Mobile Academy. These papers, we did some stuff with Stanford University as well. What these papers have done is actually put out stories from, okay, so I will use Global South, stories of work done here that is scientific, that has art and craft, and the impact it has had, the lessons learned, what went right, what went wrong, what should be done differently, out for people all over the world, whether they're academics, whether they're donors, whether they're brand owners, whether they're clinicians, to learn from. And it takes our work and it establishes us as thought leaders, and the work that we have done is absolutely cutting edge. That's one. The second thing is you've got to have friends, the other example is there's this work we are doing in Bengaluru. It's a collective impact initiative funded by H&M Foundation, and it's called Samuhika Shakti, where 10 partners are working on improving the lives of informal waste pickers. So not municipality employees, but this informal cadre that are absolutely invisible, and the general population has no idea of the invaluable work they do. So we actually built a social media brand called Invaluables. We're there on Facebook and on Insta. And we've done some pretty sort of, amazing things, and we've grown over 3 years. But that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about here is that our donor, the H&M Foundation, is deeply interested, proud, and they really want to talk about this work we are doing as part of their Positive Planet program, as part of their Inclusive Circularity program, because, if they don't talk about it, who will? So H&M Foundation has instituted an event called Open Perspectives since last year, actually 2022, and last December, for the second edition of Open Perspectives, they invited us to they chose 2 projects from all over the world. One was ours, and the other one was from Bangladesh. And they presented this film that they asked us to make on our project, and they had a discussion, okay, with a diverse set of people in the room, and they're carrying the stories of these invaluable waste pickers, the invaluable recyclers, and they're saying these are the 3 top lessons we have learned, and we are showcasing the invaluable waste pickers and the women waste pickers, and that's how the story gets told. So 2 strategies here really, that for when you're working in social impact and you're creating brands, you're creating characters like Dr. Anita on Kilkari and Mobile Academy, and the work we have done on gender and adolescent Adha Full, these stories have to be taken out, and for that you have to have bespoke, unique, out-of-the-box visibility and influencing strategies that don't have to depend on how much money you have, that are kind of not resource intensive, and there has to be a sense of ambition in thinking them up. And the second thing is that you've got to make friends, and that is why I think a lot of people in this room, I'm not putting anybody in the spot, but I think that, you know, unlike brands, when these interventions are done on very, very important issues, we need to find these interventions, need to find friends amongst the likes of you to carry those stories over and, you know, represent what's being done from the innovations, from the lessons, from representing voices to the rest of the world. We can't do that alone. And the government won't do that. The donor won't do that. So who will help us do it, right?
Thank you. That's.
I don't think I answered your question completely. I didn't talk about gender and all that.
We've
but
still
we
got
can
some
do that
time.
later.
We'll come back. So that was a very sobering start. I think the one that stayed with me is that we don't have too much PR budget for these kind of initiatives.
But thank you, you're working with us.
I know.
He is working with us on Invaluables, and he's helping us. And he's not doing us a favor. It's important to be businesslike, but it's important to have a skin in the game, and thank you for having that.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. So, Arun, from a comms perspective, what do you see as the challenges facing communicators from the global north to understand context and realities facing those in the south?
Good question. Thank you. And hi, everyone. Great to be here at Spectra. I think a lot of what Radharani says is as applicable, really, when you're looking at both sides of this equation. But if we're looking at, let's talk about global corporates, global brands, for example, because that's where I'm most comfortable. I would say there's 3 L's that are very important. So listen, learn, let go. Maybe a 4th one, loosen up. There's far too much, and I would say this goes for corporates in general, particularly global MNCs, but far too much of the communication we see in markets in Asia, for example, is still very top-down. It's still very hierarchical. It's very controlled. You know, let's localize this messaging that we've developed in head office. Let's talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion from the lens of the demographic groups that are of importance in the US or in the UK, for example. At best, it treats local markets, local Asian markets, local Asians, at best it treats them as audiences rather than participants in helping to build a brand. And I think it lacks a basic understanding that, you know, for any brand or any corporate to be successful anywhere in the world, you're relying on people to help you, not just listen to you and buy whatever you're selling. And to do that, I think you have to add value to their lives. And that can come in many ways. I think Radharani has described, you know, several kinds of projects that, for example, corporates and brands can get involved in. I think it's, you know, in general, it's just far too superficial. You know, we may see a project here or there which does tap into, for example, marginalized communities in certain Asian markets, but that's it. It's just a one-off, and then it's gone, and then, you know, it may not be revisited. It requires companies, I think, to be much more comfortable with a level of risk that they're not always, because they're dealing with people that are, you know, in many cases, many thousands of miles away from head office in different languages with different cultural nuances that they're not always familiar with. And so that requires, you know, comfort with risk, and that's something that corporates are not always great at. And it, you know, in general, I think a persistent issue is that the people that are driving this messaging just don't understand many of these countries or you know, what makes people tick in different markets around the world. You know, if you're sitting in New York or in Silicon Valley or in London, you know, you kind of have to forgive them for that perspective and that viewpoint.
I hear you, but, you know, localization is not a new concept. I mean, we've been talking about global organizations needing to understand realities on the ground for decades now. Has anything changed more recently in terms of, maybe ways of helping, sort of people in the global north understand better?
I think what needs to change actually is, so that there's lots of things that need to change, but I'll just focus on a few things. The importance of soft power. You talked about Parasite and South Korea. Is South Korea in the global south? I'm never really sure. But it's definitely not in the West, right? So we can all agree that is a really good example of the kind of soft power that makes people in these more, let's say, established or Western markets, makes them rethink some of their assumptions about people in Asia. If we're looking at it from a corporate perspective, I think it's really important to understand that soft power is as relevant to corporates and brands as it is to film, music, literature, right? And I think if you take, for example, McDonald's and Coca-Cola, right? They are symbols of America. They have built, the probably two of the most powerful brands in the world by leveraging the cultural power of American film, American music, American literature. We don't see that when we're talking about brands and corporates from Asian markets. By and large, we don't see that. There may be one or two exceptions, but in general, we don't see that. And I think part of the responsibility for that actually does lie on people that work in communications in the global south, for example. So if you're a comms head and you're working for a multinational company, you're working in India or you're working in China or you're working in Africa, I think you do have a responsibility to educate people in head office about what is going on in your local market, about the work you're doing, about why it matters on a global level, and why it's not just a local story that, when you're having your meetings, people will get to it 30 or 45 minutes in. It should be the first item on the agenda sometimes, maybe always. Why not? I mean, there's more people living in these countries than there are in Western markets. So it's such a multi-layered challenge, though, because when I talk to communicators in these companies, they often say they're often relegated to tactical roles, support roles. It's often kind of a subservient function. It needs to be completely reshaped. It's upside down in many respects. And that does require education, it requires advocacy on behalf of local communities, and it requires a level of empowerment that we just haven't seen so far.
Thank you.
I just wanted to add one thing. I was a creative director in advertising, and one of the things we did from the time I got into advertising, and I'm not dissing my old profession, not an old profession, it taught me everything I know, is, so let's look at the references. So you open up the black book or you look at films. One of the things I decided for myself when I started working in the area of social impact, me and my team, I said, we're not going to look at any references because there is no reference. If I'm working on a bonded labor project for the states of Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh and Madhya Pradesh, where I've actually gone into villages, like in the film Newton, I've actually been in a village where nobody knows who Sachin Tendulkar is. And we created this intervention called Majboor Kisko Bola, who are you calling helpless? I hope there's another time to talk about it. What reference are you going to look at? You've got to pick your stories from the people you're working with. You have to go out and do immersion, look at research, and then make your own stories, right? So I think that this whole thing of using culture is so absolutely central in transporting stories. There's a distinction that I wanted to make between insights and ideas. So insights can often be universal, when you say daag achhe hai, that children, dirt is good, children have to play and get dirty, and it's not a problem because there's a detergent that shines clothes like white. That insight can work everywhere in the world. But the way it's done in specific societies, geographies, has to be important. The way that insight has to be translated into an idea. So I think, we need to, as communicators, understand these things and understand language. I would add one more L, because I get very uncomfortable with the language that corporates use.
Sure. And one quick point. I would just say, so much of culture, wherever you are in the world, is actually driven by marginalized communities, right? So much popular culture even, it comes from that. And in general, I think corporates and brands have not, have kind of ignored that to a large extent. There's a level of exclusion. And when they do tap into it, it's on their own terms. It's often opportunistic. It's often deeply cynical. It's, maybe a one-off project, patronizing exactly. It's maybe a one-off project. It's not really understanding. And you can talk about what corporates themselves look like and the people they hire. I mean, and that probably needs to change too. But I think we need to understand that if companies are serious about the global south, they have to understand and participate in the culture that makes those countries tick.
I'm conscious we've got a ticker here that says 3 minutes and we've barely begun, but I'm also conscious that we have the privilege of having two people here who are in global roles, and we've got a room full of people here who are supporting and representing brands and communicators. So I'd like to open it up to you. What questions do you have? Anup.
Hello. Arun, I'll take the 4 L's, the one L which was there, let go. I know the context is, after your learnings at Davos, you said that a lot of organizations are letting go the word ESG. I'm not paraphrasing it because it's become a dirty word, but had a chance to work with Radha's organization, and I know some of the language part, and particularly the Char Ghat or the mobile kunji part in my home state Bihar we did. So the question here is that while at one level we have AVN, Nitin presented a beautiful report, and SPAG also had a purpose index report. The question, Global South, is it a problem, or are the organizations, because of the geopolitical situations, they are feeling a threat and moving away from their index and coming and prioritizing things which are more to do with immediate need?
I think, I think that in terms of that, there's 3 trends, I think, that are in play. First of all, corporates, particularly in Western markets, are moving away from ESG because of political backlash from right-wing politicians against so-called wokeism. So that's one trend. The second trend is corporates are under increasing scrutiny from NGOs, environmental organizations, about meeting their ESG commitments. And that is completely fair. I think if you're going to make these commitments, then you should be measured against them. But they don't always meet their commitments. We see there's a lot of greenwashing. And because of that, they're starting to green hush. So they're just not talking about what their commitments are anymore. And they're thinking, if we don't talk about it, then we can't be measured against it. And then, we won't face any uncomfortable media articles, right? So that's the second trend. And then, I've forgotten the third trend, I'm afraid. But maybe it'll come back to me in a moment. But, those are the 2 major trends, I think, that are causing corporates to retreat from this kind of language around ESG. I don't think it makes them less focused on purpose, but I think they're just reframing how they describe it.
Okay, Anubhuti has granted us another 5 minutes, so
Yeah,
Let's go.
hi, Gaurav from the Social Impact Practices Avian. So while we're focusing on mainstreaming voices from the global south, and India has shown independent thought and initiative in recent years, but often we see that the solutions for the global south countries, global south challenges come from the non-global south, the global north, if you will, and it's often driven by a white savior complex. Um, uh, but I just want you to sort of break down what are the trade-offs between having these homegrown indigenous solutions which are more adapted to the nuances of the certain communities and culture, and the solutions and resources, of course, that come, and the evidence-backed mindset that come from the non-global south. So what is better to have between the two, or should there be a combination?
I don't think we can silo it into, who does what within an intervention. I'll illustrate what I'm saying with an example. During the pandemic, I actually led on an intervention on messaging around COVID-19 in the countries of Somalia and Afghanistan. Now remember, I'm an Indian. I have a global role for a global organization, which is part of a behemoth like BBC. I'm sitting in India, and I'm working in these two countries. I'm leading teams in these two countries on disseminating, information. So I think the way we do it is, while we are working on something, building capacities of the local teams with deep humility that we don't know their culture as well as they do. We don't know the stories as well as they do. But with confidence that the process is something that I need to take them along, so they need to, because it's a communication is science, art and craft, right? So I'll give you an example. We were working for the largest nomadic tribe of Kuchis, and we were doing audio dramas. They listened to radio, which would be broadcast on radio as well as on IVR. And we were working with, in Somalia, for internally displaced people who live in urban camps and people who are therefore on social media and radio. Right? So when we were working with the Somalia team, it's a country where the creative economy is almost non-existent. And anything around health messaging is like top down. So when we did what we did, the idea actually came from them, and that is where your training as a creative director or a communication strategist comes in handy, I must say. So they came up with the idea of, we said, what can you do on radio that you can also activate on social media? Come up with an idea of an agony aunt radio jockey, Kaptan Suleiman, who people call with their problems, and then, the problem kind of goes back to COVID or behavior around COVID, COVID appropriate behavior, etc. So we did it with we actually worked on, on the scripts and on everything together. But every time there was a cultural point, there was a local thing, we deferred to them because they know what would wash literally and what wouldn't. The point is, because we worked on it together, when we went back, we had a body of work that was witty, that was funny, that was not prescriptive, that was not somebody standing from the pulpit and saying, go wash hands. And BBC Media Action works a lot with local partners, radio stations, and of course social media and television stations. So when they took this whole output in order to scale it up, because you need dissemination, right? There was this thing that really made my heart go like bumpity bump, and I was so happy. I couldn't stop smiling for 48 hours. They said, oh, we never knew that health communication could look so non-health communication. This is a new way. So what you're doing there is, because the global team, i.e. me and a small team, who, the health expert and me and another person, and the local team came together. We created content that's totally relevant, that's technically correct, but that also has a degree of creative excellence and a tonality that the country has not seen before, right? So in one fell swoop, and I'm not saying it happens all the time, we achieved 3 outcomes. So you're building capacity, you're taking the sector up by a notch. Similarly, in Afghanistan, when we did the Kuchi drama, what we did was, I just said that, this is fast fiction, little drama-lets. We will do it as a serialized thing. This is the grammar book for developing fast fiction, which is what we developed when we were working on Ebola. They took it and they ran with it. And they created a drama series of 36 episodes, little dramalets, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 2.5 minutes, cast of characters, exactly how you do a drama, The Green Hills. And it was a runaway hit. It had a lot of reach and it had proven impact. So I think that, everybody needs to loosen up, let go of egos, and these are not just words. This is something you have to put into practice, and you have to forget who you are. You just have to look at what is the goal and how do you use whatever arrows are there in your quiver to achieve that goal. So I think,
That's a great answer. Can I just say one? I just remembered the third trend, by the way. I knew I'd get there eventually. The issues have become much more divisive and difficult. So I think when corporates were, at the peak of their purpose initiatives, it was, around things like Black Lives Matter, for example, and these are issues on which everyone largely agrees. But then I think the Israel and Gaza conflict has really complicated matters for corporates, and it has made them far more wary about taking a stance on issues and retreating. And many people will welcome that because I think they saw this as kind of virtue signaling on steroids. But the risk, I think, particularly if we're talking about the global south, is that corporates, again, just think it's too risky to address these social issues, right? And they'll throw the baby out with the bathwater, if you like, and just say, okay, we're just going to have a period where we will, those stakeholder capitalism ideas are nice, but maybe for a while we'll just focus on profitability and not concern ourselves so much with our responsibilities to the societies in which we operate. And I think that's a really big risk.
Right, we're out of time, so we'll take one. We are out of time. I'm so sorry. But thank you so much, Arun and Radharani. That was, I think, just scratching the surface of a much deeper conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your experience and ideas.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.